are, first of all, what'd you do for fall break?
I was at the beach, and there was a biker convention going on. It was real interesting.
Oh, that's cool.
I don't know about that.
You know, some people went to Falling Water, and it created a new meaning for falling water. Because it poured. No telling where Batman is. I'm sure he'll show up later. The other thing I wanted to ask you guys is, have you received any notification about how to do evaluations for instruction in this class? Received any emails that have said it's time to do student evaluation of instruction?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have?
Not for this class.
For a class this semester? You have? See, the students don't know how to do this. And what about advising? Have you gotten any notification to do student evaluation? So where do you do that? Nobody in the last class knew how to get on the computer and do that.
There's like a link on the email or something.
Yeah.
That takes you ahead. It will show up soon. And then you just do all your classes.
They probably just don't check their email.
Awesome.
Well, I hope that you guys do that, because believe it or not, the most important thing we do as faculty members is teach classes, and that's the only feedback that the administration gets on whether we're doing a good job or a bad job. And most students don't even know about it. I mean, years ago, it used to be, we do those hard copy. We'd be given the evaluation, we'd bring them in and give them to you guys, and we'd leave the room, and then they'd get collected and put wherever they need to be put. But now, doing it electronically, students don't know. It's bizarre. So I would encourage you to please do that, because not only is it the only feedback that the administration gets about us, but it's really the only opportunity that you guys get to tell them how you think things are going. Because not only are the standard questions where you check, sometimes, maybe, never, always, whatever, but there are also places where you can put written comments in, and that's really important. So I would encourage you to please do that. Okay.
Next semester.
Next semester.
170. Are you just offering it 1 hour from 12:30 to 45, or is there like 2?
There's 1 and 2. It may not be open
It's
yet,
not.
though. What they do on those, they escrow one, so that the first one has to get like 10 students in it before they open the second one. So what you can do to help hasten that is go ahead and sign up for the one, and then you can drop it and get in the one you want. But hopefully you all are, has anybody been to their advisor yet? Did you go to an architecture person?
I was the first person.
Are you an architecture major?
She set me up, and then I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but like for real, like she was like, I don't know what you're doing, and I was like, I don't either, but I know.
Oh, well, are you taking architecture classes?
This semester, man.
What about next semester?
She set me up with general classes. Like, I don't even know.
Don't take that up on me.
You and I need to talk. So maybe next week we can get together and I can look at what you're signed up for and give you a curriculum plan and tell you what you should be signing up for, and you can make your decisions that way. Because if you get loaded up with the gen ed stuff, it's going to throw you out of sequence, and it'll take you an extra semester to graduate. You don't want to do that. That's a bummer. Bad deal. What other architecture classes are you taking this semester?
ACH 100, ACH 195, that just finished the class year.
Yeah, so see, you're going to need to take 170, 150, and probably 161, and then maybe, the way we have it set up, you should only be taking one gen ed course a semester so that you can graduate in time, because, well, trust me. You really, you don't want to look up on gen eds. That's going to keep you here longer. Okay. So, and I really do encourage you, even if you have an advisor, to talk to either Tom Rogers or Jeff Durham or me, because we know the deal with architecture, and we can give you more options, and it would be more better for you, more better, if there is such a thing. So please be thinking about doing that. One of the things to think about is, if you want to take that 1 or 2 gen ed courses, advanced registration's been going on for 2 weeks now, and some of those better time slots are filling up. Some of those classes are full. So it's a good idea to get to your advisor, or get to an architecture advisor sooner rather than later. Okay, so now, who remembers anything about the video from last time?
We were so far away.
Well,
We're being honest.
okay, so today we're getting into the full-blown Romanesque, but before we do that, we really need to talk a little bit about what the pre-Romanesque was telling us about Romanesque. And before we do that, though, I must ask if there are any questions about the readings. No, you understood them all. Daggone, you guys are good. Well, okay. Okay, so pre-Romanesque is essentially the period, maybe from a little bit before or around Charlemagne. Remember Charlemagne? The guy who was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, 800 AD. And he began what was called the Carolingian Renaissance, or, in other words, he wanted to reunite the Western Empire. He wanted to reestablish Roman art and architecture and culture and language, and he sent scholars all over the place trying to rediscover and determine what that was. But in his endeavors, he had his architects, if you would call them that, design a chapel for him. That thing called the Palatine Chapel. And it was based on Roman architecture of the late period of the empire. But it was constructed in a fashion more like what the early empire would have constructed. In other words, we learned that through the Roman Empire periods, they developed new techniques and better building materials to build some of those lightweight structures with significant vaulting. And the technology was lost, remember, through the Dark Ages and all those generations of people who would have been being either a priest, a peasant, or a warrior, because nobody was building anything and the technology was lost. So let me ask you another question. What do you think of when you hear the term neoclassical? Well, yeah, but what does it really mean? What does neo mean? New, exactly. So it's neoclassicism is a catch-all phrase that refers to new classicism. Well, what's classicism in an architectural context? Well, specifically, we generally are referring to Greek or some Roman architecture. But really and truly, we know now that the Greeks are the ones that developed classical architecture. Even the Romans were borrowing it from them and reinterpreting it. So in many ways, Roman architecture was the first neoclassical architecture. But neoclassical gets applied to many, many more periods in history. Like the Romanesque is considered a neoclassical style because we learned in the video that the builders were trying to copy what they thought the Romans had done. But yet, just like the Romans, they weren't exactly copying what the Greeks had done. So in the Romanesque period, they were reinterpreting what the Romans had done. So in doing that, they've created a whole new style of architecture, just like the Romans did. And we're going to see that happen even through the Renaissance, which was a period of neoclassicism as well. And even into the Baroque in the 16th and into the 17th century, and even into the 18th century. Designers were continually reinterpreting what the Greeks and the Romans had done. And we'll get into why they were doing that later on, but the important thing is that the way they did it, they infused some of themselves into it. They changed it and adapted it to their period and their needs. And therefore, it becomes a totally new style of architecture. So when we look at the Romanesque and we say, well, this is a neoclassical style, they were copying Roman forms. Well, what is it they did differently than the Romans did? That's kind of the heart of what we want to get to, really in every period, to understand what the style was and what it meant to the people. So based on that, does anybody remember from last time what those two major forces were that greatly influenced the development of the Romanesque style? There were two of them. Anybody remember one of them? I'll give you a hint. It had to do with dead bodies and pieces of the dead bodies. Begins with a P. Pilgrimage. Very good. So pilgrimage was one of the things that the early Christians were developing that greatly influenced Romanesque church design. And what that had to do with was, we saw, remember the plan for St. Gall, that ideal monastery thing? That we saw they had ambulatories in the lower level of the church that solved the traffic problem for the pilgrims coming in and seeing the pieces and parts, and then they could turn around and they could leave. And ultimately that moved upstairs in the form of an ambulatory upstairs. Well, we're going to look at a lot of examples of that today. So there was pilgrimage, and what was the other major influence? I sort of just gave it away. Well, pilgrimage had to do with relics.
Okay.
But the other one was, what was the plan of St. Gall for? The closest thing to a city? A monastery. Yes, monasticism was the other major influence. And that's simply because, remember what Trachtenberg told us, in the Dark Ages, you were either a priest, a peasant, or a warrior. And we saw in the video as well that monasticism began to flourish in Western Europe in the 6th century. So it was an alternative lifestyle, if you will, for people during the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages. And these monastic groups began to flourish and multiply and ended up becoming major landholders in France in particular. As a matter of fact, some of you may have heard of an event in history, happened around 1789, called the French Revolution. You know, the let them eat cake thing. yes, they were revolting against the monarchy, but also against some of these monastic groups who had become so wealthy and powerful during the Middle Ages and beyond because of land acquisition and farms and all sorts of value creation, that they were strangling the country of France, literally. So a lot of these monasteries were burned during the French Revolution, and their land was taken away from them. Well, okay, so a little bit of background on the pre-Romanesque. Those are very important things to kind of understand as we move into the full-blown Romanesque today. And of course, the first thing in the bullet is 11th century. Gosh, we've already gone up to the 1000s. Wow, we're moving along. Improved economy. Well, yes, that's true. But part of that may have had to do with the fact that you know that the Christians believed that at the end of the first millennium, that was when the second coming of Christ was going to occur. So that's kind of good news and bad news, because what does the second coming of Christ mean? The end of the world, exactly. So the good news is we get to go to heaven. The bad news is we got to go now. Because you know that old saying, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go now. Can we wait a little while? So, you know, Trachtenberg talks about in the 9th century and into the 10th century, sort of a depressed period. You know, Charlemagne died, and what he had tried to do in terms of reuniting the empire in the West sort of began to crumble because there was a lot of jealousy and disagreements, and his people who came after him wanted their own piece of the pie. So things began to split up again quite a bit. And we saw, rather than the Holy Roman Empire, we saw the political structure was more smaller kingdoms and fiefdoms and smaller regions of people who didn't get along too well and who really didn't communicate with each other except through pilgrimage. The only real communication between those villages were the pilgrims traveling. And of course, we know that greatly influenced the design of Romanesque architecture. So you can imagine in the year 999, sitting around in the living room around the fireplace on December 24th, 25th, and everybody's saying, oh, well, this is the last Christmas. Bummer. 26th comes around, 27th, and everybody's thinking, well, you know, how many days we got? But all of a sudden, January 1st comes. We're still here. January 2nd, January 3rd. Well, it didn't take too many days for them to realize, guess that isn't going to happen. So, let's get back to work. Improved economy. But you know, that's another very human thing about us as a species. Probably most of you all do not remember. But it's part of what that Y2K thing I was talking about was. People with computers or thinking computers weren't programmed to roll over to a new millennium to 2000. But more things were going on. I've got literature in my office that I collected. All these groups sending out stuff in the mail. The end of the world is coming. I mean, it was all over the place back in 1999. So I don't know what it is about us as a species, but when maybe we're all numerologists, but when those numbers start rolling over to 1,000, another 1,000, oh, we think something catastrophic is going to happen. Who knows? Well, the middle bullet, Romanesque architecture, was spontaneous. It happened. But it was also international. And what does that mean? Well, when we think of international today, we think of America, and we think of Europe, and we maybe think of Africa, and then we think of China. Well, in those days, it was more like Kentucky and Indiana, Kentucky and Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio. I mean, things were much closer together. It was more regional. what we would consider regional was international, because there was no centralized government. People operated in small pockets. It was still a feudalistic society. They had structured into larger areas than maybe a manor with serfs or a monastery with monks, but it was still relatively small from what we would think of today. So what made it international was the region. Because what I want to try to establish today is that there are some very consistent, specific elements of Romanesque that make it Romanesque. But what makes it regional is how those different regions applied maybe local building materials to those designs that were very specific in being Romanesque. So location, building materials, construction styles, all had an influence on making it more international. So when you went from France to Spain, or regions of France to regions of what are now the countries of Germany or Italy, it was still Romanesque, but yet it was different. It's, again, sort of like barbecue. Go to Tennessee, it's barbecue, but it's not like what we get here. But you get the idea. Regional. Okay, so you may recall from the video last week that I cut the video off before they started talking about the Norman Romanesque, which comes from Normandy, which is in the northern region of France. And in 1066, the Normans crossed the English Channel, conquered England, and they took that style of architecture with them. And it ultimately became English and morphed into English Gothic architecture. And the reason that I wanted to stop the video before that segment is because when we look at Gothic architecture, we normally say that it has three distinct elements. One being pointed arches, another one being flying buttresses, and another one being rib vaults. Well, Norman Romanesque architecture has all of those elements. And upon first looking at it, most people think it is Gothic architecture, but it's not. It's Romanesque. In other words, those elements don't make a building Gothic. There's a very fundamental difference between what is Gothic and what is Romanesque. And it has to do with the way the structure of the building supports the roof and ceiling loads. With Romanesque, it's all the heavy masonry thickness of the walls. But Norman Romanesque, even though it has all those Gothic elements, is still considered Romanesque because the majority of the support is done by walls and not columns or flying buttresses. And I think that's a little confusing when you first start looking at it. But as we go through today's lecture, what I want to try to do very clearly is establish what elements make the Romanesque Romanesque. Some visitors. Okay, so that's my goal today, to establish that very basic understanding of what is Romanesque. Okay, so we begin with this example, the Imperial Cathedral in Speyer, and we see a view of the church and a date, 1030 AD, just at the beginning of the 11th century. So when I look at this church building, there are two very distinct characteristics about this church that want to tell me that it is Romanesque. And they are, first of all, two terms that we began to describe in the pre-Romanesque, in particular in the PowerPoint on the church or the Abbey of St. Riquire. And the first one, and they both have to do with towers, the first one is this element at the entryway to the church with a tower, this massive stone blockade, it looks like, called the Westwork. And it's called the Westwork because normally Christian churches of this era were oriented with the entryway toward the west and the altar toward the east. Hence, the term Westwork, referring to the massive facade and any towers that would be associated with the entryway to the church, versus the Eastwork, which is the series of towers that would be built up around the transept and nave crossing. So, that'll be on the exam. Westwork, Eastwork. So that begins to tell me right away that this is a Romanesque church. But focusing more closely on the entryway, it's really that massiveness of that stone facade and entryway. Trachtenberg tells us it's almost like a barrier on the street between the street life and the interior of the church. Well, when we look at the facade, other characteristics that tell me this is Romanesque is the small, relatively small and few number of windows or openings in the wall. Because they didn't put big openings in Romanesque churches because they were depending on the massiveness and the thickness of the walls to support the building. And since they used a lot of arches, which is the other characteristic, rounded arches, for Romanesque churches, we know, I hope by now, that these arches generate lateral forces. So there has to be wall mass in that wall to counteract those lateral forces. So relatively few openings and relatively small. Even though that's a big doorway, when you look at the overall mass of the facade of that building, there are not a lot of openings in that facade. Another confusing thing, though, this window in the center is referred to as a rose window. And that, too, is normally associated with Gothic architecture. Well, you have to realize these churches were built, 800, 900 years ago. And oftentimes they got remodeled or added on to over the years. So depending on what was in fashion at that time, like the new style of Gothic, they may have gotten a Gothic arch. They may have gotten a Gothic window. So that even further compounds our distinction at looking at Romanesque buildings to sort of be able to pick through what has been added on and look at the basic structure of the building and say, okay, this is a massive, thick-walled building, so it's Romanesque. Okay. Well, okay, you say, well, why are all these smaller openings, so many of them, up at the top? Well, naturally, there's less load up there, so they could open up some of the walls at the top. All right. The next characteristic, this is a close-up of that central doorway. And we begin to see that, wow, this is the thickness of this wall. From here to here. It's a massive wall, but look at how they've articulated that wall with these series of additional receding arches and little colonnettes. So that's another characteristic we see of the Romanesque, the way those thick walls are articulated and decorated to sort of soften the touch, if you will, of the massiveness. And then, of course, each one of these arches that recede back to the doorway are called blind arches because they're not really arches until they get to the door opening where you can see through the arch. Otherwise, they're blind arches. So very thick, very articulated walls. This is a view of the apse, the back end of the church, and you can see that indeed there are more smaller windows and more arches and more blind arches, even arches with no windows around them, even though these have blind arches with the windows. And even these sort of arched projecting elements underneath this conical shaped roof, which are called balachios, by the way. A lot of arches, a lot of arches, a lot of masonry work. And these towers are actually relatively tall for Romanesque, but who knows? They may have been added later. They may have been added to later. We don't know. Okay, now this drawing begins to illustrate, even though it's sideways, with the dark crocheted lines and the hatched crossing lines, illustrating that parts of this church were built in the 11th century, corresponding to the dark lines. Parts of it were built in the 12th century. So we begin to see characteristically in a lot of these Romanesque churches, most of them, that they were built over time. They were added to, they were changed. But one of the things we want to point out when we look at this plan, there's that ambulatory. The altar is not out at the very end of the apse anymore, but rather it's been moved in, and this ambulatory allows the pilgrims to go through the church, view the relics, without disturbing whatever might be going on in this area of the altar, and a newly expanded area that they call the choir. And that's related to monasticism, because originally, and they still do, in monasteries, the monks get in that central part of the church and sing and pray. So, the choir area. Okay, here is an interior view of Speyer. And notice, you can see it a little better on the right side, the walls where the arched openings are articulated with blind arches and colonnettes, just like we saw in the doorway. So they articulate these thick walls to break them up. Also notice that there are clear story windows, but they're not huge. Even though, and in this photograph, you see this line right here and right here. You can barely see it here. That is rib vaulting, because it's not a straight barrel vault like these arches make it seem in this photograph. And what rib vaulting does, it helps transfer some of the loading of that stone ceiling to the particular points where the colonnettes are in this wall. So again, here's another variation in what we normally associate with Romanesque versus Gothic, the rib vaulting. But it's still a Romanesque building, even though it's got rib vaulting. Okay. Well, now we jump back a little bit in time, maybe 30 years, to what Trachtenberg tells us is the first church. This is a country church near the Alps in France, Saint Martin du Canigou, which is supposedly the first fully vaulted, constructed Romanesque church. And you can see it's on a sloping site, and it has all of these series of buildings that create cloisters and all sorts of spaces. Here's an interior view. You can see it's very undecorated. It uses the arch construction and the vaulting, and it looks very rustic. And there's a term for that. They call it premier art romain. Whatever that means. That's what they call it. And here we have a side chapel. Once again, no windows, vaulted construction. And really, no windows or small windows is a better way to think about Romanesque, because of the arches and the thrusts and the need for those thick walls to help support those arches. Here is a view down the main nave, and you see this is a barrel vaulted rough stone ceiling. One little bitty window at the arches being supported by these columns. So very heavy, massive type of construction. Even on the exterior where we see some blind arches and some colonnettes, and even some colonnettes supporting arches, but lots of arches. Another surefire characteristic of Romanesque, rounded arches. Okay, so another example in France, Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. And this church illustrates some other characteristics that are specifically Romanesque. First of all, we see the massive entryway, which is the what works? Westwork. You need to memorize that. It'll be on the exam. The westwork, but no towers. Well, it probably is because they haven't finished the church yet. And that's something that we have a little bit of difficulty understanding in our society, is that in these European churches, they might be 800-year-old churches, and they were started 800 years ago, and they built part of it, and then they had a war with some little neighboring village, and they stopped working on it for maybe 50 years, and they started working again for a while, and something else happened, like maybe a plague, and they quit working maybe for 100 years, who knows? But they continue to work on it. But that further illustrates how important as centers these churches were to these people. And I used the example in the earlier class about the city of Venice. Now, you guys have probably heard of Venice, Italy. And do you know that Venice was a totally man-made built city? It was started around the 4th century, time of Charlemagne, and it was built in a lagoon. A lagoon is like a swamp. There's no land, bogs, water. So they began to take tree trunks and drive those into the water and the mud as pilings. And that's how they created the land for the buildings. Because it's true, when you submerge timber like that, and there's no oxygen, it won't rot. So parts of Venice have been there for 1,500 years or more. So they kept doing that, and the city developed. It was probably built to where it is today by maybe the 1200s, 1300s at the latest. But what I'm getting at is, because it's a city that was all man-made, and they put all those pilings in the water, you can imagine that open space is at a premium. And it is. I mean, there are no there are pedestrian streets in Venice. They're usually about the width of these hallways in this building, and there are canals. So it's a very densely built up city. The only open spaces you find, and they don't call them squares or piazzas, they call them campos. And it's around where the church is. That's really the only open space in the entire city of Venice to speak of. And it was where all of their neighborhood activities occurred, whether there were festivals with the church or feasts of the church. I mean, the church was the center of their lives. And it was in these other medieval cities as well. So, okay, we've got a transept plan. We have this single tower over what we would call the what works? That was down here.
Oh,
Minus 10. Eastworks. You got to get that straight. Got to get the terminology. Okay, so here's a view from ground level. And indeed, it sort of looks like it's unfinished, even to the extent that the corner coin finish stones only go up a certain distance on the front. And then look at this. Another round window, usually associated with a rose window, usually associated with Gothic. And look at this arch right here. Pointed arch. But it doesn't make it Gothic. It's still a Romanesque church. Rounded arches in the doorways. And by the way, did you happen to pick up in that video when we were being told about Gisli Berdus. You remember who Gisli Berdus was, right? That sculptor in the Middle Ages. And they kept talking about the location of his sculpture. And they kept calling the doorways portals. Did you pick up on that?
So, was it the one that was like a hell next to it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So when you rewatch that video, remember that the portal is one of the doorways. And then they talked about the sculpture being located in the tympanium, which is that recessed area above the door. Just like with the Greeks and their pedimented temple fronts, the relief sculpture is in what they call the tympanium. So again, just little tips on vocabulary for when you're watching that video, because you will watch it again, right? Yes. Okay, good. So this image of the floor plan of Saint Sernin is very telling. I mean, we can tell right away when we see this ambulatory that it's a Romanesque church. But also, look at all of the radiating chapels, even in the transept area. So that when the pilgrims come in and go around the sides of the church and into the transept, bam, 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 you know. If they're given donations at each one of these relics, they're broke by the time they get here. But there were other things happening on the side walls of the church. Have any of you all ever heard of this devotion or act called the Stations of the Cross? They still do that in Roman Catholic churches. There are like 14 paintings along both of the side aisles, and they depict the scenes of Christ's conviction, crucifixion, and burial, and all that. So it is a rite that is still performed, a prayer rite in the Roman Catholic Church. So they were doing stuff like that elsewhere in the church. But at any rate, the big tell-off here is the ambulatory and the radiating chapels. That really lets us know this is distinctly Romanesque. However, you'll note this term, square schematism. What is that? Well, that refers to the way they would lay out the floor plans of the churches during this period. Excuse me. If you'll notice, the layout of these columns and the whole space of the church seems very regular, very ordered, very rational. And that's because they would take the square at the crossing of the main nave and the transept, and they would cut it either in half or in fourths. And those dimensions that define the main crossing, excuse me, ultimately dictate these areas that are these longer rectangles, which are called bays. Each one of these spaces is referred to as a bay in the main nave, and they would be half the size of the square of the crossing. And then each area in each of the side aisles between the columns would be 1/4 of that square. So it's all geometrically related, and most likely they didn't have a standard unit of measure that they were working with at that time. So they did what the Greeks did. They relied on basic proportions and ratios in laying it out. So that's what square schematism is referring to. Okay, here's an exterior view showing those radiating chapels from around the apse, and you can see how heavily decorated or articulated those masonry walls are, and all the arches and the blind arches and the rounded arch windows, or as we call them in Kentucky, circle top windows. They're rounded arch windows. Okay. And then here we have a view of the side wall, and we see more of those rounded arch windows and blind arches and decorative coins around the window openings. But notice these vertical elements right here, here and here. Those are called buttresses. They're thickened portions of the masonry wall that help give support to the building. Now, we're gonna see, if we go back to this image, you see those buttresses here, and even up here at this level. Well, in Gothic architecture, we normally see what are called flying buttresses. And that's when those buttresses become columns outside the building. And they have arches that go back to help support the wall that is supporting part of the roof system and even up higher. Like a series of fingers holding the walls of the building up. Well, once again, we're going to see a little bit later some Romanesque churches that have flying buttresses in places on the exterior. Doesn't make it a Gothic church because the walls are still the main support, not the flying buttresses and the columns. So we'll focus very heavily on that as we transition into the Gothic. But for now, I want you all to understand that those three elements, pointed arches, flying buttresses, and rib vaulting, appear in a lot of Romanesque churches, but it doesn't make them Gothic. It's still the massive, thick, heavy, articulated walls that make it Romanesque, along with the ambulatories and the radiating chapels. Okay, here's a little bit better photograph of those radiating chapels, and you can really get a better idea of how really articulated those wall surfaces are. And here's an interior view of St. Sernin. Notice it does have a barrel vaulted ceiling. Now at this point, I'd like to inform you that those barrel vaulted ceilings, they're made out of stone. So, have you ever thought maybe about how in the world they built those? Well, if you think back to the way the Romans built their arches with the centering, the temporary supports, they had to do the same thing on a much larger scale. So all of those arches in the ceiling here and all of the stonework that is the ceiling in between them all had to be temporarily supported while it was being laid in place. So you might ask the question, well, why in the world would they use stone ceilings? Well, it had to do with fire. Because early Christian churches had wooden timber ceilings. And remember, they didn't have electricity, so all of these chandeliers and other things would have been burning candles. And there were fires. So the stone ceilings ultimately were as a fire prevention device. Now, I want to go back to the exterior. Notice how small the windows are in that clear story area. There they are again. There's a lot of stone and masonry material. And that's because just inside those walls, about right here, is where those barrel vaults are coming down to hit this wall. They need a lot of masonry to support those lateral thrusts. So when we get into flying buttresses and other true Gothic design, all of a sudden these buttresses are supporting all of that stone weight. So the areas or the bays between the buttresses in a Gothic building can open up to larger windows and big areas of glass. And that's going to be one of the major differences we see when we transition from Romanesque into Gothic architecture. Okay. Gisli Berdus. All right. There's that devil trying to tilt the scales. What a bad guy. There's the woman with the serpents gnawing at her breast. There's those hands that come down from nowhere and grab somebody. Okay, finally, we get to an And you'll notice in this whole complex of buildings, which we know from looking at the plan for St. Gall, would have had guest houses, brew houses, bakery, cattle, stables, everything that they needed for survival. And what's the biggest building? Look at how big that church is. And look, it not only has one transept, it's got two transepts with radiating chapels on all of them, and then an ambulatory with all those radiating chapels. So, hey, must be Romanesque. I'll bet it's got an eastward and a westward too. But notice that it says Cluny 3, which means that was the third church they built on this site. If you look closely right here, there's Cluny 2. So there's part of the older church that's been built into now an open area or cloister. And then I believe, I'm not sure, but I think over here was the original church. So we get a small church, a little bigger, to this humongous church. And it got humongous because the monastic order was getting bigger and bigger. And more people were there. And they had more land and more money. And they believed that for certain religious ceremonies, all of the order needed to be in one church. So that's why the church got so big. And it does reflect how big their congregation had gotten. Well, here is an exterior view, a drawing of what that church would have looked like. And you can see all these radiating chapels, and indeed you can see an eastward here, the transept, and a westward down at the entry. And uh-oh, look at these. See these elements here, 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 and over here? Those are flying buttresses. But they don't make it a Gothic building. It's still a Romanesque building, and the reason is because the massive, thick walls are still doing most of the support. Now, I'd say this is what it looked like. During the French Revolution, this is one of the churches that was burned. So it no longer exists. But if you want to visit a monastery, you can do so right here in Kentucky. Take a little trip down to Bardstown and visit the Abbey of Gethsemane. And of course, you can spend the night there if you want, for free.